Human reason has this peculiar fate that in one species of its knowledge it is burdened by questions which, as prescribed by the very nature of reason itself, it is not able to ignore, but which, as transcending all its powers, it is also not able to answer. Immanuel Kant. Dialectic has become an important and quite famous term in philosophy, mainly because of Hegel and his dialectical method, or the dialectical way in which the spirit develops according to Hegel. And then other thinkers after Hegel have picked up that sort of his in one way or another. So dialectic plays an important role in communism, because it is based on a theory of the dialectical development of history. Or you have the Frankfurt School with something like Adorno's negative dialectic. Here in this lecture, since it is a Kant lecture, I will not address these later meanings of dialectic, just like I won't address earlier meanings of the word. However, while Kant's use of the word does differ from the use Hegel had, it still informed and influenced Hegel. And so if you want to understand this later meaning of what dialectic came to mean, it is certainly helpful to first understand what it meant for Kant. For him, it is our reason which is dialectical in its, metaphysical attempts. Metaphysics is the child of reason to Kant, because, it is reason, as I explained in the last lecture. It is reason which is the faculty of thinking a priori, and it is reason which transcends our experience. If we only had the intellect, I mean, it's not really possible to have a being which has intellect but no reason, but still, if we imagine that for a second, that we had intellect but no reason, we would probably never do metaphysics. We would probably never think about things like God or the afterlife. We would stick to this world around us, this world we can experience. Through our intellect, we would try to understand this world, the rules that nature follows, and, to do our daily business in that world. Our intellect thinking would be immanent. I talked about the difference between immanence and transcendence in my lecture on what is metaphysics to Kant. It is only through reason that we ever venture beyond the realm of experience, that we ever think in a transcendent way, and that we ever think about the supersensual. Because it is reason, as I previously explained, which always desires totality, desires something absolute and unconditional. And since that can't be found in the realm of the sensual, that is what drives us into the realm of the supersensual. And this becomes a problem, as Kant shows. Because if we try to do metaphysics, we are going to try doing it through synthetic judgments a priori. And I already made a lecture about synthetic and analytic judgments too. Because it is clear that when we want to judge about our ideas such as God or freedom or immortality, this has to happen a priori, independently of experience. Because, again, they are supersensual things. They are things that we are seeking outside of experience. We can't transcend experience and then on the other hand make a posteriori, that is experience-based judgments. That would make no sense. But also these judgments a priori in metaphysics can't just be analytic, because analytic judgments, according to Kant, are just explaining judgments. They just explain what we already, even though maybe unconsciously, know. But we don't just want to know what God means, what we are thinking when we are thinking of this idea of God, but rather we want to expand our knowledge about God or about immortality. We want to know, is there a God? Is there an afterlife? And well, it is synthetic judgments through which we expand our knowledge. So we would need synthetic judgments a priori in metaphysics, which is exactly what led Kant to the question the whole critical project is based on, the question, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? And I already talked in previous lectures about the answer that Kant gives. I said that according to him, every synthesis, every connection between two concepts requires a third in which this synthesis is done, and this third must be viewing or intuition. And all our viewing as human beings, since we are not God, since we don't have some sort of intellectual viewing, all our viewing is sensual. So all synthetic judgments require sensuality. And what Kant says, or what his conclusion is basically in the Critique of Pure Reason, is that sure, synthetic judgments a posteriori, they require empirical viewing. They can only be done when we actually experience something. So I can judge that ravens are black because I've seen black ravens. And on the other hand, it is possible to make synthetic judgments a priori, to expand our knowledge without actually using experience, but only as long as we do this synthesis in the form of our viewing, in pure viewing, that is in time and space. Which means that we can have synthetic judgments a priori, but they can only be judgments about things which can appear in time and space. Meaning we can know things without experiencing, or so to say, before experiencing them, but we can only have knowledge without experience about things which can be experienced. We cannot have knowledge without experience about things which completely transcend experience, like God, or like freedom, or the immortality of the soul. So I already talked about this in previous lectures. I said we have these 12 categories, these basic elemental concepts of thinking, like the category of causality. And we also have these principles that stem from the categories. And they are not empirical. They are something we have a priori. They are transcendental, meaning they are the condition of the possibility of everything empirical. So going back to the principles that I talked about in a previous lecture, we can say a priori that everything we are ever gonna experience will have an extension in time and or space. And we can say a priori that everything we are ever gonna experience will, as a sensation, have a certain intensity, a certain degree. Those principles, once again, are not empirical. They are transcendental, because we don't take them out of experience. Rather, we can only make experience because we have them. But they are still immanent because they are still about experience, even if they come before experience. But if we try to make synthetic judgments a priori about God or freedom or immortality of the soul, synthetic judgments a priori which are not based on time and space, but rather transcend time and space and everything that could be experienced in time and space, everything that could appear to us, then that is not just not empirical, that is not immanent anymore, that is transcendent, and this transcendent thinking doesn't work. This means that we can fantasize and be enthusiastic about these ideas, but at least when it comes to theoretical philosophy, the practical is another matter about which I will eventually also talk, but we cannot philosophize about them. We cannot really have knowledge about them. And this is where we get to the dialectic. Because what does dialectic mean to Kant? Well, I already addressed it in my lecture on what is philosophy to Kant, because there I talked about logic, which to him is the formal philosophy dealing with the formal laws of thinking. And I said that to him, logic has two parts: the analytic, dealing with the basic elements of our thinking, being the doctrine of truth, so to say. And on the other hand, there is the dialectic as the doctrine or the teaching of illusion, because the dialectic deals with wrong arguments, with wrong conclusions, with illusionary and deceiving pseudo-logical arguments. Now, of course, the critique of pure reason is not a work on simply on logic. Logic is simply formal, abstracting from all material, from all the content of thinking. And in the critique of pure reason, Kant is interested in that content of our thinking. In the content of the pure thinking, so abstracting from all the experience, from all the sensations, and asking what is left without the sensations. But still he's interested not just in the form, but in the content of the thinking. But nevertheless, he divides a large portion of the critique of pure reason into these same two parts, into a transcendental analytic. This is where he deals with the basic elements of our thinking, like the categories and the schemata and the principles, which I already discussed. And then there's the transcendental dialectic, which once again is the doctrine of the illusion. And like in logic, it is not meant to be a doctrine teaching illusion and teaching you how to create illusions, how to deceive others with sophistical but ultimately wrong arguments, but rather it is supposed to be the teaching of how to get rid of illusions. It's supposed to lift the illusions from you, and it is supposed to make you see through the fallacies in thinking. And what Kant says is that our reason, by its very nature, by this desire for the unconditional and absolute that it has, is dialectic. That means that it creates an illusion for us. So dialectic in general for Kant always means the doctrine of the illusion in thinking, and the part of the science that tries to lift the illusions and to get rid of the illusions. But in mere logic, which is merely formal, dialectic deals with illusions that are not necessary, but that are possible, that someone could create using some fallacies in arguing. But here, when it comes to the transcendental dialectic, Kant is not talking about an illusion created by some sophist to deceive us on purpose, but rather he's talking about an illusion we create for ourselves, so to say. An illusion that is in the nature of our reason. Our reason deceives itself when it comes to God or freedom or immortality. And Kant does, however, say that this illusion can be lifted. So what he says is that even though it may sound paradoxical, in nature we cannot understand everything. There will always be things left in nature that we don't quite understand. But as soon as we go beyond nature, we can understand everything and answer every question. That may sound paradoxical, but it makes sense once we realize that going beyond nature really means not going into another realm, into a higher nature. In fact, that is the very illusion we want to lift, but rather it means going into ourselves, into our own thinking. Ultimately, these ideas, they are not really about God or freedom or immortality. They are about us and how we think, how we must necessarily think. That is why here, when we go beyond nature, our questions must be solvable, which does not mean that it must be possible to answer them in the sense of saying, yes, there is a God, or no, there is no God. But it must be possible to at least show beyond any doubt that the question cannot be answered and why it can't be answered. And this is exactly what Kant wants to do in the dialectic. He wants to lift the illusion. So he does say that in a way the illusion will always stay, even when we have seen through it. We will then understand that it is an illusion, but that will not make the illusion go away. So the dialectical arguments our reason produces will still seem correct to us even when we understood that they are incorrect. This can be compared to how we see the sun. After Copernicus, we now know that the sun doesn't revolve around the earth, but rather it's the other way around. But still, Kant would say the illusion is still there. If I look at the sky over the course of a day, it seems to me that the sun is moving along the sky. And if I watch a sunset, it seems to me as if the sun is sinking beyond the horizon. And even though I know better in my thinking, the illusion still remains. And the same is true here in the dialectic. So that is what dialectic in general means when Kant uses that word. He doesn't just use it in the critique of pure reason. There's also dialectic in the critique of practical reason when it comes to the idea of the highest good. Likewise, there's a dialectic in the critique of the power of judgment when it comes to the question, can we dispute about taste or not, when Kant discusses the question of beauty. And likewise, there's a dialectic when it comes to Kant's philosophy of religion. There's a dialectic when it comes to his philosophy of justice. There's even, you could say, even though Kant doesn't use the word here, a dialectic in his thoughts on pedagogy. Again and again, what he means by dialectic in all of these fields, and I will talk about all these various dialectics in time, What he means by that is always the same, is always that here reason is in conflict with itself. Here reason is creating a sort of illusion which may seem convincing for us, but which ultimately is an illusion, which in these various dialectics Kant always tries to make us understand and thereby get rid of. But here in this lecture, I want to stick to the dialectic of speculative reason, which deals with the three ideas of, once again, the soul and its immortality, freedom, and God. And I already said in my lecture on what is metaphysics to Kant that these three ideas to him make up the core of what metaphysics is about. But the question is, why? Like, it is clear why they are dialectical, because they are ideas. They are, I explained what ideas are to Kant in the last lecture on what is reason. They are concepts of reason that, as such, transcend all experience, express a maximum, a totality, and since they are transcendent, since they go beyond what we can know, reason here becomes dialectical. But my question now is, why these three ideas? And here you have to be mindful of Kant's architectonic method, about which I also already spoke in another lecture. Because Kant doesn't want to do philosophy in a simply empirical manner. He doesn't just want to, so to say, roam around in his own thoughts and come up with, oh, okay, I have these three ideas. I happen to have these three ideas of soul, freedom, and God. So now I will inquire into these three ideas. Because that would always leave the possibility that you missed, that you overlooked something. Another person could maybe say, oh, but I have another or even more ideas that you didn't discuss. So maybe you are right about these three ideas and they are dialectic, and maybe I agree with you in this, but here I have these other two ideas in my head that are also dialectical, and you didn't address this. You didn't lift my illusion about these ideas. Kant, through his architectonic method, always wants to make sure that he is thorough and that the science he is working on is complete, because he has deduced the parts. He has not just found them empirically by happenstance, but rather he has deduced the parts as being necessary. So how does he deduce these three ideas? Well, here you should remember how Kant found the 12 categories of our intellect, the 12 pure concepts our intellect has. Because, I mean, the ideas are also pure concepts, just concepts of reason, not of the intellect. I discussed this in my 3 lectures on Kant's solution between empiricism and rationalism, and then on the table of judgments and the table of categories. And I said that the intellect, according to Kant, is dealing with sensuality and bringing synthetic unity into sensuality. So really the question is, how is this done? And it is done through 12 functions of judgment. We have 12 ways of judging, that is, of connecting things, of creating synthetic unity between the manifold sensual impressions. And once the intellect reflects on these 12 functions of judgment, it gets 12 pure intellectual concepts, 12 categories of thinking. Like, for example, when the intellect reflects the problematic judgments, judgments that say something could be the case. I don't know if it is the case, and it certainly isn't necessarily the case, but it could be the case. If we reflect on the way we are creating unity here, we get the concept of possibility, saying something is possible. Or if we reflect on the hypothetical judgment, then a judgment that says if A, then B, if it rains, then the earth gets wet, then we get the concept or the category of causality. Because I find causality is what I'm thinking here, right? Causality is why this A is connected to this B, because the rain is the cause of the earth's wetness. Well, as I explained in my last lecture on what is reason, reason to Kant is the faculty of conclusions. So what he says now is that just like the categories we get when the intellect reflects about its judgments, we get the ideas when reason reflects about its conclusions. And so to get a complete list of all our necessary ideas of reason, what we need is first, a table of our possible conclusions, of the functions of concluding. Just like for a complete list of our intellect's categories, we first needed, a table of our possible judgments and their functions. And once again, if this is somewhat unclear, if you don't fully understand it, you should listen to these 3 earlier lectures on empiricism and rationalism, on the table of judgments, and on the table of categories, because I think if you understood those, then what I'm saying here now should be quite clear. Now, when we ask what are the functions of our conclusions, they are pretty much the same as the functions of judgment. And here I will remind you what I already said that before a few times, that our thinking, in the end, it really is one. Kant talks about these 3 faculties of thinking: the intellect, the power of judgment, reason. But of course, they are not completely different minds that were given to us and that are completely different in nature. But really, our thinking is one and the same, and so it is always following the same structure. Meaning, we make conclusions in the same ways we make judgments. So, for example, we have positive or negative judgments, like Socrates is mortal would be a positive judgment, an affirmative judgment, as Kant calls it. And a negative judgment would be, for example, Socrates is not a chicken. And just like that, I can have affirmative conclusions, like saying all humans are mortal. Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates is mortal. Or I can have a negative conclusion, saying humans are not chicken. Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates is not a chicken. Or if we go with the hypothetical judgments, if someone is dead, he is not breathing anymore, I can make a hypothetical conclusion. If Socrates is dead, then he's not breathing anymore. Now, he is dead, so therefore he is not breathing anymore. So therefore I don't need to talk in detail about all the various functions of concluding, but rather I can refer back to my lecture on the table of judgments, because if you understand how our judgments work, then you would also understand how our conclusions work. All I will add is that, as I mentioned in the last lecture, in classical logic, syllogism has these three parts: the two premises, major and minor, and then the conclusion. So, for example, all humans are mortal would be the major, and Socrates is a human, and that would be the minor. And then the conclusion, therefore, Socrates is mortal. The type of a conclusion, according to Kant, would be determined by the major, by what type of judgment a major is. So, for example, if I say humans are mortal, that is an affirmative judgment. I'm saying that the subject human does have this predicate of mortality. And then I can go on, Socrates is a human, so therefore he's mortal. So this whole thing would be an affirmative conclusion. While if I start off with a negative major, humans are not chicken, and then go on, Socrates is a human, so therefore he's not a chicken, then this would be a negative conclusion. So really, what type of conclusion we are dealing with is decided by the major, not by the minor. Because in the second case, the major was negative. Humans are not chickens. So here I'm saying that the subject does not have the predicate of chickenness. But the minor was in fact not a negative judgment. It was again an affirmative judgment. I said Socrates is a human. But still, the conclusion as a whole is negative because the major is. Anyways, this is what gets Kant to these three ideas. He gets them from the three types of conclusions of relation. So the first one would be the categorical conclusions. And just like the categorical judgments, they express a relationship, a simple relationship between a subject and a predicate, right? So the categorical judgment would be Socrates is mortal. And categorical conclusion would be humans are mortal, Socrates is a human, therefore he's mortal. Here I'm saying that this subject has this predicate, this attribute. And now if we reflect about this type of judgment, this categorical judgment, with the intellect, we get the category of substance and accidents. So we think of a thing and of its attributes. Now, if reason reflects about the same type of conclusions that conclude that a predicate belongs to a subject, and reason always has, once again, this desire for totality, for the unconditional, then reason will demand a subject which is not in turn conditioned by another subject, which does not belong to something else, but which is totally its own subject. And that would be the soul. That is how we think of our I, of ourself. We think that we don't depend on something else, but rather everything else may depend on us. Even our own bodies, it feels like we are not an attribute of our body, but rather our body is an attribute of ours. Like I can imagine being completely disconnected from my body as a spirit, or if you want, being transferred into another body. I cannot, on the other hand, imagine my body being completely disconnected from me, because then, well, if somehow my soul and my body would get separated, I would be the soul, not the body. The body is only mine so long as it is, so to say, an attribute of that soul. And I can even go so far as to imagine everything being an attribute of myself. That would be what empirical idealism does, or that would be, if you want to go even further, what is nowadays called solipsism, where you say that the whole world is just in your consciousness. It's just your imagination. Even other people may just be your imagination or whatever. That is something that we can imagine. But we cannot imagine really our soul belonging to something else as just an attribute. So here reason comes up with this idea of the absolute subject, which is not an accident anymore. Now, if we look at the hypothetical conclusions, hypothetical judgment would be something like, if someone is dead, he's not breathing anymore. And when the intellect reflects about that sort of judgment, it comes up with this category of causality, because that's what at play here. Someone being dead is the cause of him not breathing. Now, if we take a hypothetical conclusion, like if someone is dead, he's not breathing anymore. Now, Socrates is dead, so therefore he's not breathing anymore. And now reason reflects about that. Reason is not content with just thinking of causality, just thinking there's a cause and an effect that was caused by that cause, but rather reason asks for the ultimate cause, for a totality in this chain of causality, for a starting point of that chain. So reason asks for something which may be a cause of other things, which may be their condition, but which itself is uncaused or unconditioned. And that would be freedom, because that is what freedom means, being a cause without yourself being caused by something. And lastly, we have the disjunctive conclusions. Now, disjunctive judgments, that was, for example, human beings are either dead or alive. And when the intellect reflects on that, it gets the category of community or commercium, or the whole and the parts, because it reflects on the fact that here it has a general concept, like in this example, human being, and that concept is divided into parts, human beings that are alive and human beings that are dead, which together make up the whole of that concept. Now, when reason reflects on disjunctive conclusions, like, well, humans are either dead or alive, Socrates is dead, therefore he's not alive, then once again, it is not content just getting some whole with some parts, but rather it realizes that that whole is itself a part of a bigger whole. So, for example, human beings are part of all living beings, right? I can make the disjunctive judgment that all the living beings are either human beings, or they are dogs, or they are cats, or they are fish, or they are tulips, or they are roses, and so on and so on. It would take some time if I were to now list all the species there are. And again, I can find a higher concept which contains the other concepts as its parts, as its species. So with its desire for the unconditional, for the absolute, reason now comes up with the idea of a most real being, the highest concept, so to say, which itself is not a part of something even higher, but of which everything else can be a part. And that is the idea of God. And this is how Kant gets these three ideas out of the three functions of our reason in making conclusions of relation. Now, of course, you could ask, why just relation? Why are there just those three ideas? Why are there not 12 ideas like there are 12 categories? And this is a question that Kant doesn't really address in the Critique of Pure Reason. So if you really focus on the architectonic of the system and don't just accept what he writes at face value, then this might confuse you. In some lectures, Kant actually does give a bit of an explanation. And basically, well, this is because of the nature of reason and because of the nature of Kant's inquiry. The other 9 functions would not give us their own ideas. If we look first at quantity, I mean, when it comes to the judgments, we had singular judgments and particular judgments and universal judgments. But when it comes to conclusions, they are always universal. This is basically the nature of reason. Reason is always universal. Because reason, as I explained earlier, is the faculty of thinking a priori. And, well, a priori, independently of experience, we cannot, so to say, single out one individual case. We can only do that based on experience. When we are thinking in general, we can only make general statements. And you can realize when you reflect on the syllogisms again, that indeed the major is a universal judgment. Like when I say humans are mortal, Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now the minor and the conclusion may be singular judgments, but the major says all humans are mortal. And you can easily realize that if it didn't, we couldn't really make a conclusion here. Like, if I make a particular judgment, some humans are Greek, and try to take that as my major, some humans are Greek, Socrates is a human, then just going by these two premises, I cannot come to the conclusion that Socrates is Greek, because it just says some humans are Greek, meaning other humans are not Greek. And if all I know about Socrates is that he's a human, I don't know if he is among those humans who are Greek or among those who are not Greek. Only if I say all humans are mortal, and Socrates is one of these all, then I know that what is true for all humans, mortality, must be true for this one particular human. When it comes to the quality, there may be a difference for the formal logician. between affirmative and negative and infinite conclusions. But Kant, since he's not dealing with logic here, since he's not simply interested in the form, but rather in the content of our thinking, Kant can put this difference aside. Because whether my conclusion is affirmative or negative, in this case would not give me a different idea. It would just make me think about the idea differently. So I can say, for example, there is a God or there is no God. We are free or we are not free. That doesn't change the idea as such. And I mean, what Kant is interested here is getting these ideas and then asking, what can we even know about them? Can we even make affirmative or negative statements about them? So therefore, he leaves the quality aside too. And lastly, when it comes to modality, well, in our judgments, we have, of course, problematic, assertive, and apodictic judgments. And therefore, we have these three categories, if we reflect about them, of possibility, existence, and necessity, and their opposites. But when it comes to reason, all our thinking is necessary. There is no such thing as mere possibility or mere existence in reason. This is something I talked about in previous lectures, that all thinking a priori is necessary. Because what would be the grounds to say that something is not necessary here? We can only say that something which isn't necessary still exists if we know of its existence from experience. But if we know of some thing's existence from a conclusion, then all we can say is that it exists necessarily. We can see that in the syllogisms. The conclusion is always necessary. If human beings are mortal, and if Socrates is a human being, then it is absolutely necessary, and we don't need the experience that he died to prove it. It is absolutely necessary that Socrates is mortal under these conditions. The only way he could be immortal was if at least one of those two premises was wrong. Like, if he wasn't a human being but a god secretly, or if maybe not all human beings are mortal, but only many human beings. But if these two premises are correct, then it is necessary for this conclusion to be correct. So all which reason is thinking is necessary. All these three ideas of the soul, of freedom, of God are necessary, Kant would say, and that is why he can leave that out too. And that leaves us only with relation and the three conclusions of relation leading to the three ideas that I listed. So we necessarily have the idea of a totality of the subject, of an absolute subject, that is the soul. We necessarily have the idea of a totality of dependence, which is the world, and of an absolute cause, which is freedom. And we necessarily have the idea of the totality of the vision, of the totality of a whole, of which everything else is a part, and that would be God. And this is what gives us three metaphysical sciences. I already talked in my lecture on what is metaphysics. I talked about the architectonic of metaphysics according to Kant, and I listed the various parts, the various subfields that metaphysics has according to him. And well, here we get rational psychology. And as I said in that other lecture, that has nothing to do with what Kant would call empirical psychology, which is what we nowadays call psychology. But rather this would be a metaphysical science thinking about the soul, asking, is the soul immortal, or how is the soul connected to the body, and so on. Second, we would get rational cosmology. And as I said in that other lecture, that the connection between cosmology and freedom may not be immediately obvious, but basically the cosmos, so the world as a whole, is that net of things being connected by one law of causality. And the question here is basically, is the world determined completely by this law of causality, or is there somehow the possibility within the world to start a new chain of causality? So is there freedom within that world, or is there just a natural law? And then lastly, we get rational theology dealing with God. And these are the necessary parts of metaphysics, according to Kant. Or at least the necessary parts that are dealing with some idea and that are dialectical. As I explained in the lecture on metaphysics, Kant also identifies other parts. He identifies the ontology, the doctrine of being or of essence, which deals with what things in the most general sense are, the basic elements that all things, may they be ideas or may they be empirical concepts, the basic elements that all things have. But that ontology is just dealing with the categories of our thinking, about which I already talked in a previous lecture. And that ontology is not dealing with a specific idea that transcends experience. Rather, Kant can show that these basic elements of our thinking, since they are just basic elements of our thinking, not of objects as such, but of all the objects that we can think, they are indeed the basic elements of all the objects we may experience, but we cannot go beyond experience. So that was why the classical ontology turns into transcendental philosophy for him, into a philosophy that deals with the conditions of the possibility of experience, but not anymore with the basic elements of things in themselves that are independent of our experience. And Kant also identifies as part of metaphysics rational physics, which deals with the concept of matter and tries to, get metaphysical cognition about matter. But this, to Kant, is not, it's not an idea that is necessarily in our reason, but rather matter is something we find in experience. And in this part of metaphysics and rational physics, we just try to think about what we can know about this empirical object before experiencing it and independently of experiencing it. But these three fields of metaphysics, the rational psychology, cosmology, and theology, these are based on these three necessary ideas of our reason, and these three are dialectical to Kant. And with this, he shows that metaphysics is not completely arbitrary, and it's not just a pipe dream, and our metaphysical ideas are not just chimeras, but rather they are necessary ideas of reason, and therefore metaphysics, at least as a project, is necessary. And I mean, this is a question that had to be answered, right? Even if you say that in the end those ideas are just chimeras, they are nothing. They are not ideas of something but of nothing. Still, as ideas, they are something. Like, the atheist may deny God, but he can hardly deny the idea of God. He can hardly deny that people have this idea of God, and that it seems to be a quite universal idea. An idea that has been popping up all over history and all over various different societies. So even if you want to deny the object of that idea, you'd still have to explain where that idea comes from. And that is exactly what Kant is trying to do here. Of course, he's not the first trying to explain this, but if you don't want to go with Descartes and say that God sort of put that idea into our mind, or if you don't want to go with Plato and say that the soul has seen the ideas before birth, and then when being born has somehow forgotten them, but can sort of remember them. If you don't want to go that way, then you will probably have to go with Kant's explanation. And Kant's explanation for the ideas is basically similar to his explanation for the categories, about which I talked in my lecture on the divide between empiricism and rationalism. That is, Kant agrees with the empiricists that we are not simply born with a number of concepts, be they categories like causality or be they ideas like God, just in our head. He agrees with the empiricists in a way that our intellect is empty when we are born. But he is saying that while we acquire our categories and also our ideas in the course of our life, they are still born out of our intellect. They don't come from experience. And here Kant agrees with the rationalists, but rather they come from us reflecting about the ways we are thinking in, about the functions of our thinking. When the intellect reflects about our judgments, it gets its categories. For example, when it reflects about the hypothetical judgment, it ends up thinking of causality. And likewise, when reason reflects about its ways of concluding, it gets its ideas. Like when reason reflects about the hypothetical conclusion and about causality, it gets this idea of freedom as the absolute start of a chain of causality. And that way, the ideas don't have some, supernatural origin. Rather, they originate in the nature of our reason. Now, unlike the concepts of the intellect, the ideas don't really have an object. Rather, they are about those very concepts of the intellect. They are the representations, that they are the necessary representations of the totality of the intellect's categories. And I mean, in the last lecture, I already said that it is the intellect which is connected to sensuality, while reason is never connected to sensuality, at least not directly, but rather reason is connected to the intellect and thereby indirectly to sensuality. I said that reason is the faculty or the ability of thinking about thinking, so to say. I said that while the intellect thinks about sensuality and brings syntactic unity into the manifold of our sense impressions, reason brings syntactic unity into the manifold of our thoughts, of our concepts. And that is what you can find here now. If you think about it, the intellect, in all of its thinking, is thinking the subject, so the one who thinks, and the object, that which is being thought and that which is being cognized. And that object, in turn, can be understood in two ways. It can be understood as the object you have an image of, or it can be understood as the object of thinking, the object you have a concept of. Meaning that we have three parts in our intellectual thinking. The subject, the empirical object, and the object being thought. And now the three ideas that Kant identifies are just each of these three parts taken and increased into a totality, right? So the soul is the absolute subject. That is not object at all, just pure subject. The world, and then we may ask if this world is completely caused or if there's freedom in that world, but the world is the totality of the object we can have an image of. And then God represents the totality of our thoughts about the object. Like he's not in the totality of the image. We don't see God amongst the objects, and he is also not the sum of all the objects we see. But when we think about the objects and their condition, then the total condition would be God. If you think back about how we have cognition, or more specifically empirical cognition, that is experience according to Kant, which I explained over the course of several lectures, I said that in all our experience there are two basic parts. There's sensuality and then there's thinking. And now sensuality itself, again, has two parts, right? There is the sensations, so the impressions we have, and then there are time and space as the form of viewing, so the forms in which we do have these sensations and in which we receive these sensations. But if you take sensuality aside, because once again, reason is not directly connected to sensuality. Reason is only connected to the intellect, and only thereby indirectly to sensuality. If you take sensuality aside and just look at the side of the intellect, there the process of experience has three parts, Kant says. First, there's the apperception, about which I have a lecture already. Second, there's the apprehension, about which I have a lecture. And third, there is what you could call intellection, which is what I deal with in my two lectures on what is experience and what is the intellect. And now, if you reflect about these three ideas, you will realize that they correspond to these three steps of making an experience. Kant is saying that the intellect is synthesizing in three ways, is creating three synthetic unities of the manifold. And now what reason does is simply thinking to each of these three synthetic unities an absolute. So apperception meant the synthetic unity of our various representations. The intellect basically saying all of these representations are my representations. They belong to me. I am the subject who thinks all of this. And now when reason, so to say, absolutizes this, maximizes this thought, then we get the idea of the soul. Secondly, in apprehension, the power of imagination apprehends the various impressions, the various sensual data that we receive in time and space, in order to unite them into one image, and therefore make it possible for them to be perceived. Now, when reason thinks the totality of this apprehension, it thinks of the world, so of everything that could possibly be apprehended. And lastly, in the intellection, the intellect with its concepts understands what it is we are perceiving. It gives these perceptions meaning and sense, and it also connects the perceptions into actual experience through its concepts like causality. And well, once again, reason wants to totalize this and think to all the concepts the, so to say, highest concept, which would be the idea of God. This last point may be a little unclear, but don't worry about that. I will explain it further and make it more understandable in the lecture dealing with that idea and with what Kant says about rational theology. So really, all that reason does here, according to Kant, is trying to get a totality and trying to get a completeness of the three syntheses that the intellect does. Reason wants completeness of the conditions of thinking, and the condition of thinking would be the I, the subject which is doing the thinking. Reason wants completeness of the conditions of empirical thinking, and that would be the world. And reason wants completeness of the conditions of pure thinking, and that would be God as the highest concept on which all the other concepts depend. I will add to this that Kant stresses reason only necessarily goes in one direction when demanding completeness, when demanding the unconditional, and not in the other direction. Because, I mean, you could think that just like you can ask, for example, for the beginning of the world, you can ask, has the world been there forever, or has it started at some point? Has it been created? Just like that, you could ask for the end of the world. You could ask, will the world be there forever, or will it end at some point? And of course, this is indeed a question you can ask and you can try to think about, Kant says, but it doesn't have the same necessity from the very nature of our reason as going in that other direction. And that is because reason wants totality, but that means mainly reason wants the first, not the last, because if there is something, like not the first or the last, something in between, if there is something that is conditioned, then the intellect says, well, it must have a condition. If the conditional is there, then its condition must also be there. And again, if that condition is itself conditional, then its condition must also be there. And this is exactly where reason will come in and say, well, so this can't be an eternal chain of the conditional and its conditions. There must be an unconditional. There must be a starting point. There must not with the same necessity be an ending point. Like if, for example, you have a child there, then with that child, there must also be or have been parents. And with the parents, there must also be or have been grandparents. And with them, there must have been great-grandparents, and so on. And now you can go all the way back, and reason can ask, wait a minute, so where did they all come from? This can't go on forever. There must have been some sort of first human. But on the other hand, with a child being there, while its parents and grandparents and so on are now necessary, it is not necessary in the other direction that a child itself must have children and grandchildren and so on. So it is possible for this chain to go on, or it is possible for this chain to break at some arbitrary point. So it is these three conditions, these three absolute conditions of everything else in our thinking, which is conditional, which reason is thinking about. It is only these three ideas which are necessary in our thinking. I will also stress, of course, that by these ideas being necessary, Kant is not saying that their objects are necessary. So it is necessary, if we reflect enough, if our reason goes along with its desires, that we come up with these ideas of an immortal soul, of freedom, of God, and it is necessary for our reason to come up with dialectical arguments and proofs here that may create a sort of illusion of having actual knowledge. But it is not necessary for these things to actually exist. I mean, that is the very question that metaphysics and that Kant is dealing with. And the problem here is that the categories of our intellect, like causality, they are conditions of the possibility of experience. So we can say that these things do necessarily exist. It is necessary that causality is in place because we have experience. And if the things were not connected by a chain of causality, then we could not possibly experience them. That is Kant's transcendental insights, that these categories are conditions of the possibility of experience. And since there's a reality of experience, the conditions must indeed be real too. But these ideas of the soul, of freedom, of God, they are not conditions of the possibility of experience. I can make experience whether they are real or not. And therefore, we don't know if they are real ideas or just chimeras. And that is exactly the dialectic of our reason. And now, in the critique of pure reason, the transcendental dialectic is really the core of the whole work. Because, I mean, Kant is asking about the possibility of doing metaphysics. And it turns out that it is possible to have an ontology, but that ontology turns into transcendental philosophy. I made its own lecture about transcendental idealism, and Kant's idealistic insight is that we are never dealing with things in themselves. All we are dealing with is the things as they appear to us, phenomena and not noumena. And that means for ontology, as I already said, that the basic elements of all things which we can identify are really the basic elements of our thinking. And that's exactly why they must also be the basic elements of all the objects of our thinking, because otherwise we couldn't think them. Otherwise they couldn't appear to us. Otherwise we couldn't experience them. But that means that this ontology, or now transcendental philosophy, only holds true in regard to appearances, in regard to the things that we experience, and not in regard to things in themselves. But from the soul transcendental idealism also follows that we can never transcend the appearance. we can never go beyond it into the realm of the noumena, of the things in themselves, of the supersensual. And therefore, metaphysics, in this case, when it's not just doing ontology or rather transcendental philosophy, does become dialectic and doesn't work. We can't make synthetic judgments a priori. We can't expand our cognition. We can't acquire knowledge about the soul or freedom or God. And this, therefore, it's the heart of the critique of pure reason, because it leads Kant to the conclusion that basically the whole work is meant to prove, and that is that we should abandon this type of metaphysics because it's just enthusiasm, it's just fantastical, coming up with things that may or may not be true. Therefore, it's sort of a waste of time, or also something that could confuse our thinking and have negative effects even on our empirical thinking. And rather, Kant suggests we should stick to that which we can know. And that is, on the theoretical side, what natural science tells us. And on the practical side, it is what morality tells us. It is what our duty is and how the nature we live in is made up. Those are the two things we can know, but the world beyond that nature and beyond our moral duty is something we can't know. That is the result of the critique of pure reason. But before, in much later lectures, I will get to what Kant says both about morality and about natural science, I still want to stick to the critique of pure reason and to the dialectic, because so far I only talked about it in very general terms, and now in the next upcoming lectures I want to get into the specifics of these three metaphysical sciences of rational psychology, cosmology, and theology, and how Kant describes and explains reason's dialectic in each of these cases, and how he lifts the illusion concerning each of these three ideas. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Thomas Deuringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, Christos Pei, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.